Hey guys, welcome back to the CyberTalk Podcast. In this video, I'm going to be going over how I got started in cybersecurity. And the objective here is to sort of give you a series of milestones within my career and sort of outline why they're important and what I learned in each of these phases or periods of my life or my career for that matter. Now, why am I covering this? Well, I think it's something that I haven't covered before, and the reason why I want to cover it now is because it gives you sort of a context as to what my background is with regards to technology or IT and also cybersecurity. So, to begin with, just would like to point out that I got started in cybersecurity quite a while back, probably more than 6 or 7 years now, probably more than 7 years ago. And my experience was not really traditional, if I can put it that way, primarily because of how I got into the field. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about how I got started with computing, give you an idea as to how that went and what I learned during that phase. That was sort of within the period of high school and university or college. So my first experience with a computer was the home computer, and at that point in time, I wasn't really interested in what you'd call IT. I was primarily interested in just learning about how the operating system worked and sort of exploring the internet and taking a look at a couple of websites. I really didn't have a fixed point of interest. And then I got my first computer, which was a laptop that came pre-installed with Ubuntu. At the time, I can't remember the exact release, but it was a very old release of Ubuntu with the GNOME 2 desktop environment. So it's not what I wanted. I just want to make that clear. Of course, at that time, the primary operating system of choice was obviously going to be Windows. At the time, it was probably between the releases of Windows 2003 and XP, moving on to Windows Vista. But either way, I really was saddened by that. But at that point, I didn't really have a background in IT or technology, if you will. So I just got started with Ubuntu or Linux, if you will, which is a little bit crazy when I look back at it now. But because I didn't know how to sort of reinstall an operating system, I couldn't really change much. So I got started with learning about Ubuntu. Of course, I'd had previous experience with Windows, so it was quite different. Everything was different, from the way you installed software to the way you managed the operating system, how the operating system is built. So, I got started primarily by, performing Google searches and then taking a look at the forums, essentially answering questions that I had. So if I wanted to install something and I couldn't install it the traditional way through maybe the package manager or the package management utility on Ubuntu, which was still the advanced packaging tool, I would go out there and, sort of learn about how Linux worked. Not directly, this was more indirectly, and it tied into questions that I had about how the operating system worked. So if I didn't know anything, pretty much just perform a Google search. So I learned how to use Google quite a lot to find exactly what I was looking for. And I think that was very, very important. Either way, I messed up the installation, but by that point, I knew how to sort of reinstall Linux and also install Windows. And that was really interesting because at that point, when I had gained experience with regards to the command line or the terminal, if you will, and I'd learned how the Linux file system worked, how processes worked, the user space, and how the kernel worked and how they interacted with each other. I really didn't feel the need to switch to Windows. At the time, that laptop didn't have the ability to virtualize, or didn't have virtualization, enabled. That processor rather did not support virtualization because it was, still a very new feature at the time. And I really couldn't, install Windows unless I was dual booting, which I'll get to in a second. It's something that was really, really annoying, really cumbersome at that point in time, especially if you're trying to install Windows and then Linux, and essentially managing those installs can be quite tricky, if you only have one drive, regardless of whether you partition it or not. So, I learned about how to use Linux. I started playing around with the kernel. playing around with kernel modules, building the kernel, testing out other kernels. So, essentially got my hands dirty with the kernel and system administration. As I said, indirectly at that time, I really didn't know that was an actual job or a skill, if you will. And then that sort of led into development. So, when I was sort of playing around with Linux, at that time, there wasn't as many packages as there are now with regards to, third-party solutions. So, I sort of started to get this idea in my head that, maybe I should learn how to build something, because from the way this looks, I mean, binaries are pretty simple with regards to how they're built or compiled, and I can reverse engineer binaries, or at least find out how they work. And I know that on Linux you can easily develop a binary with C. I started getting into development. More specifically, I'd already gotten started with some basic scripting with bash scripts to sort of automate a wide variety of tasks. At that time, automating startup applications, sort of customizing how my experience was playing around with cron jobs, automating that, automating syncing of files, or just basic stuff with bash. And that sort of piqued my interest in development. So that pointed me towards C and C++ development, which I did quite a lot even into university. Developed a few applications here and there, and also used the Qt framework to develop programs or apps for Linux that sort of solved problems, very basic problems. When I went into university, I started developing more professional programs that that were essentially created to solve very simple problems out there in the world. But at the time, it was a huge learning experience. I also learned how to build my own Lisp, which I'll probably cover in another video, but it sort of gave me an understanding of programming languages, how they worked, their syntax, etc. Around the same time, I also, sort of delved into Android development just as a hobby. It was really interesting that, it was all open source, and that, of course, conjoined very well with Linux because, with Android, because, Android was essentially, just a fork of Linux, and it was, at that point in time, Android was starting to, to essentially become very popular. So it really fascinated me that, the model that Google had adapted, whereby, the development environment, the SDK was essentially free, and you could develop and test Android apps, and that sort of tied in very well because at that point in time, I actually got my hands on an Android device. I think it was Android version 1.5. I can't really remember the code name. I think it was Cupcake or something like that. And then, of course, Eclair and all of that good stuff. So got, my hands dirty with Java, didn't like it at all. Also, XML, and played around a little bit with web development, primarily PHP development. I learned the basics of HTML, Bootstrap, CSS, a bit of JavaScript, which I still don't like to this day. But yeah, my experience with Java was not really good. It didn't make sense to me coming from a C++ background. But I understood, why that was the case. And so, it was just, with regards to Android, it was just playing around. I would eventually go back to Android, but that will come later. Around the same time, I started doing what you would call, very basic hacking, if that makes any sense. One of the great things with Linux or Unix-based operating systems is the tools that, you could find online and in forums. So, getting started with tools like Nmap, playing around with binaries, reverse engineering them using strace, stuff like that, and eventually through those forums, which I still can find to this day. I can't believe I didn't bookmark them. But I learned about Backtrack Linux, and that's where I sort of got an introduction to security, right? Or at the time it was offensive security, or that's what it was called. I'm talking about the term, not the company. Backtrack was, of course, developed by Offensive Security. So I thought this is really cool. So I decided to dual boot Backtrack's Linux with Ubuntu. At the time, there were a couple of other distributions. Arch was, alive and well, but that at that point seemed very daunting, especially the install process. But I was gaining experience with that, learning how to install Linux from scratch, etc. So I installed Backtrack, essentially set it up to dual boot. And it was, really, really cool actually when I look back at it, primarily because, it was a change of pace. And at that point, I didn't realize that this was a specialized distro, if that makes any sense, in that you really can't use it for, day-to-day tasks, but it has everything you need to, conduct an assessment, a security assessment. So started playing around with the tools, learning how they worked and what they were used for. At the time, there were quite a few old tools that don't exist anymore. Most of them were developed in Perl. This was, before Python became the de facto, development or scripting language used to develop tools or automate stuff with regards to cybersecurity. So, learned a lot of stuff there. Got started with the Metasploit framework, but at that time there wasn't really any Vuln Hub or anything like that. There were a couple of VMs that you could test your skills on, but at that point, again, as I said, the computer I had did not support virtualization. So, insofar as I was learning how these tools worked, I didn't get any tacit experience with, actually testing and using these tools against a vulnerable system or learning how they work, but I would test them against, systems that I had, or, the family or home computer. And, that is where I sort of got started, with regards to technology. So, you can see there's sort of a synergy of multiple things coming into play here. One of them is Linux, which, as I said, is still weird to me to this day, that my first operating system that I used primarily was Linux. Of course, I'd used Windows before that, but that was really, it was just, hey, there's a computer, maybe I can play some games on it. Then really, it was just a computer. So once, technology piqued my interest, it started becoming very interesting. And as I said, my experience with Linux was very valuable, and then that led into university. And as I said, I learned a lot of development, especially in computer science. That's the primary objective there. So I learned a lot about how operating systems are developed, or how they're designed, and how to write assembly, how to write very basic, assembly, how to write very basic programs in assembly, a bit of debugging, and then of course, there was emulation of older architectures, so 8080 and stuff like that. But yeah, got really interested in development and Linux, primarily C and C++. As I said, I developed a lot of programs and applications that worked really well, but they really didn't do much. So sort of sharpened my skills, got a few certifications in development, and also got started with Windows. Well, not got started, but started gaining experience with Windows and how Windows works, and developing ASP.NET applications, playing around with Visual Studio, etc. So primarily focused on development. And then of course, I also went into Linux system administration, so got a couple of certificates in that. That was essentially the route I decided to go down, where I was going to become a system administrator. And sure enough, I actually got started as a system administrator, and I worked for two companies, but the roles and responsibilities were pretty much the same, whereby you're responsible for setting up and maintaining servers, both Windows and Linux, for customers and clients. At that time, the cloud wasn't really a thing, or hadn't really picked up. So when companies were setting up the infrastructure, they would require servers, either, as I said, Windows or Linux, to host web apps, databases, and in the case of Active Directory, setting up the whole Active Directory environment. So I was essentially responsible for that. I learned a lot. A lot about IT infrastructure, DevOps, compliance standards, Windows and Linux. Now in a professional environment where I had senior sysadmins who had been working with Linux since the 90s. So I really learned a lot about operating systems there, how to automate a lot of stuff. So by the end of maybe I would say about 2 or 3 years, I pretty much automated or streamlined my workflows I could, easily spin up a server. I had a couple of bash scripts for different use cases to configure it, and stuff like that. And that was essentially what I was responsible for. The key, the key learning experience there was, as I said, learning about how companies work internally, learning about how to handle client requests, about how to manage expectations for clients, a lot of project management, and as I said, a lot of the technical stuff to do with enterprise environments, dealing with developers, admins, and DevOps and compliance standards and Active Directory, enterprise Linux, all of that good stuff. So very, very interesting. At a certain point, I'm not really sure when this became, a big thing within that company, but at a certain point, the threat landscape was becoming more, I would say, it was essentially growing, which meant that a lot of customers were complaining about getting hacked, but these were not really hacks that had any motives. They're essentially just, hey, I broke into your web application and I dumped your database. But at that time, there wasn't really any malice with regards to what guys were doing or what hackers were doing. I'm specifically referring to hackers. So pretty much overnight, I was now responsible for securing infrastructure, or securing mostly Windows and Linux systems and hardening them against attacks, which, as you know, is quite complex, primarily because I didn't have a security background. At that time, there wasn't there wasn't the term cybersecurity. At that point in time, it was called information security, which still makes me laugh. But that was sort of how I got started in cybersecurity professionally. So I learned about how to secure servers, how to secure services, harden boxes, and how to collaborate with the developers and admins to ensure that we have that they're using best practices. I also learned about security policies, and around the same time, the company started consulting with a pen testing company. At that time, that was a very, very new term, but as I said, they usually went under the name, the industry was, still under information security, but it was under offensive security. So, there was a lot that they did with regards to, compliance, essentially performing audits, vulnerability scans, essentially identifying vulnerabilities and misconfigurations and telling you, okay, you need to fix this. So they essentially the company, began consulting with a pen testing company, and they essentially hired them to perform a few pen tests for our clients. And, as part of that, I was supposed to sort of work with them and alongside them to sort of give them an overview of the infrastructure that they were testing at the time. And of course, that's where I got my first rude awakening into scope and, the actual letter of engagement, and the fact that what we were doing had an inherent threat to it, because if we brought down infrastructure, then that would be a huge issue. We could not really work or perform our assessments, or the pen testing team could not perform the assessments during the day, because that was during business hours. So I learned about all of that and the implications of performing a pen test. So I essentially shadowed them, and it was really, really cool, because for the first time I had seen security through a different paradigm, right? So before, I was thinking of it primarily through the lens of the blue team, even though there wasn't a blue team, at least for me at that point. But I was primarily in defensive security, and there was a couple of solutions that we were using, what you'd now call modern day vulnerability scanners or vulnerability management systems. And of course, on the Linux side of things, there are a couple of auditing tools that we were using, but just very basic defensive stuff. So this really opened my eyes to actually see that cybersecurity, can be handled in two ways, really, or there's two different ways of looking at it. There's the blue team side of things, which is where you're responsible for securing and hardening infrastructure, and then there's the red team side of things, which sort of confirms or validates the security mechanisms that you've put in place. What do I mean by this? Well, I learned very quickly that it's not enough to, just implement a security mechanism or to change a configuration file and say, okay, that should fix the problem. You have to actually test the changes that you've made to ensure that, you've remediated a vulnerability or misconfiguration. So, if I change an SSH configuration, or if I try and harden SSH, I can't really be sure that I've, fixed a vulnerability or misconfiguration until I actually test it. So I realized very quickly that that's what pen testing was. Pen testing was, essentially testing the IT infrastructure of, at that time, the IT infrastructure of a company, and, sort of looking through it through the eyes of an attacker. And also, guys then also had experience with defensive security, so they're also looking for common misconfigurations and stuff. So, I learned about that. I learned about the benefits of offensive security and the fact that they identified so many vulnerabilities within, their first week. It was a real eye opener. And even though I thought I'd remediated them, I was, very quickly shown that, that was not the case. I had not tested what I had done, or tested the features or, mechanisms that I'd put in place. So, that was a huge eye-opening experience for me. And, I really enjoyed that period of time with that pen testing team because, number one, I learned a lot. Number two, they were really funny. They had a, really good sense of humor, and they were answering a lot of my questions. I mean, whenever didn't understand something, they would answer that, and, essentially shadowed them. And this sort of began my interest in offensive security. As I said, I've had a background with defensive security, but mostly, at a very basic level, although I have consulted with companies and, helped them set up their blue team and, stuff like that, which I'll not get into right now. So this sort of piqued my interest in offensive security, and I began learning about pen testing through, again, your standard Google searches. I learned there were, courses offered by SANS, and at the time, the OSCP had just become available. So these were things that I was interested in, and, I was really keen on. So, I also spoke to that pen testing team and said, I really want to get into this. This looks like something that is, very dynamic. I like the fact that, pen testing is a high pressure, high stress type of working environment. I really like that because it was, just, focused on the meat and potatoes of, of security all the time. So, and of course, you're responsible for attacking infrastructure. So I thought that was really cool. So, I spoke to them, and they essentially pointed me down the right path. They said, you can shadow us for, a couple of assessments, learn, we'll point you in the right direction with regards to training. At the time, you really needed to get training through a vendor because there wasn't any free resources. And that would tie into why I started HackerSploit. But yeah, I didn't find a ton of resources. The resources that I did find were in the form of books and, of course, training provided by vendors with, certifications like Security Plus that would sort of, give me my formal introduction to security or cybersecurity. And then, of course, there was the whole pen testing certs that I did. And that sort of gave me my first foray into, pen testing, as it were. And, after shadowing these guys during, the process of learning pen testing, they actually offered me a role as a junior pen tester, as an intern to begin with. But they essentially assigned, during an engagement or assessment, they essentially assigned, tasks or phases of the penetration test to me and a couple of other guys who were just getting started, and, of course, under really good supervision. So, performing reconnaissance, enumeration, stuff like that. And then, of course, we would, see how the pros did it with regards to exploitation, post-exploitation, lateral movement, privesc. So I learned a lot about the vulnerabilities of both operating systems, whether it be Linux and Windows, and also learned about the, Active Directory. And, I learned that Active Directory is a huge part of, a company's infrastructure, or most companies' infrastructure. So I learned how Active Directory works, as part of the internship process. I was then responsible for setting up an Active Directory environment to actually showcase that I, did understand how it worked. So a lot of learning, a ton of learning about, operating systems at a different level, in the context of how they're used within an organization, and the inherent vulnerabilities that or misconfigurations that can essentially be brought up due to this type of configuration and setting. So, learned about infrastructure, Active Directory, learning about offensive security, how to perform pen tests, how each phase of a pen test is segregated and how it needs to be, properly followed through, how to then report the data that you've got from that phase to, the point of contact within your team, and then how this all fits within a report and how that becomes actionable for the company that you've performed the pen test for. And of course, at the time, the company also started offering red teaming services, which was now a different paradigm because it was now a much wider scope with regards to what you could do. At the time, there was, this was sort of the birth of adversary emulation and, classification of threats, and sort of, the red team assessments or operations that were being performed were essentially built around that. There was, of course, the testing of physical security and also at that point social engineering. But what was really interesting to me was that you could essentially emulate an adversary and all of their behaviors. At the time, the MITRE attack framework was still, I think, a very basic framework. There wasn't, what you see today. And, APT groups are not being classified or, at least being classified efficiently. And their classification was not really informative. But, that's where I sort of got started as a pen tester. So I spent a couple of years there as a junior pen tester. I learned a lot. I can't really go over all that I learned, but I learned about pen testing. I learned about reverse engineering and, as part of red teaming stuff and adversary emulation, I learned about malware analysis, reverse engineering, as I pointed out, development with C again, taking a look because the company had its own toolkit at the time. And, at that point, it was also the about the same time that Kali was being released, the first instance or instantiation of Kali was being released. I learned, a lot about web app pen testing and learned how to use those tools correctly. I learned how to diagnose issues with tools, how to maintain a toolkit. I learned about a ton of stuff, really, with regards to pen testing. And then, of course, I was promoted to a senior pen tester after a couple of years, and I was essentially mainly responsible for leading the actual pen tests, and where I conducted over more than 50 pen tests, and they were very successful. Learned a lot, very fun, very difficult at times. A lot of mistakes were made, but again, I essentially learned a lot there. And it was around this time that I realized that cybersecurity was being, at least in the case of offensive security, was being handled incorrectly. And I had started to see changes within the industry with regards to how companies needed to start taking this seriously, because at that same time, there was sort of the birth of cloud computing, and companies were now starting to embrace technology and, utilize more and more services online. And, I started seeing that this whole pen testing framework that was being used up to that point was sort of becoming ineffective, right? So I sort of wanted, at that time, I didn't know that was the case, but what I was sort of envisaging was purple teaming, right? And I'll not get into purple teaming in this video, but I'd sort of seen a synergy of, the blue team and the red team, and also the engineering side of things, and how security can be handled much better if these elements are in place. So I decided to start my own pen testing company, more so a cybersecurity company, because I also wanted to, provide services, not just only in the red team side of things or with regards to pen testing, but also defensive security. So helping companies, set up their digital infrastructure securely, helping them create security policies, setting up managed security services and SOCs, stuff like that. So essentially wanted to, provide both aspects, both red teaming and blue teaming. At that time, those terms were starting to essentially take their take their shape as they are today. And I also wanted to integrate adversary emulation quite a bit into our assessments, especially for financial institutions or companies that required it. So, at that time, there was also there was also the actual beginning of adversary classification, whereby if an APT group was targeting financial institutions in a region, and we were able to sort of pinpoint and identify the tactics and techniques that they would use. At that time, of course, we're still not using the MITRE ATT&CK framework as it is today, but if we're able to identify that, then we can tell companies, hey, we can essentially emulate this adversary and see how you guys respond. So that's really I felt that was sort of the best way to test specific organizations within specific industries. For smaller companies, that was really not important. But that sort of led me to start up HackerSploit, which, as I said, was not really just focused on the offensive side of things. HackerSploit offers pen testing services, blue team services, and also cybersecurity training. And that's sort of where I learned that there was a huge gap with regards to cybersecurity training, not vendor specific training, but just open source information that can help guys get started. Because had I not got the start I got with regards to system administration, I thought to myself, I would be completely blind here, because I sort of got the correct introduction to it and the correct foundational knowledge and precursor knowledge and information that was required for me to get into this successfully, if that makes any sense. So when I would perform searches on Google and YouTube, I realized that yes, there was content, but this was content that really didn't have any specific outcomes, if you will, or learning outcomes. So I said, well, that's very interesting. I think what I can do is I can start up a YouTube channel and offer this for free, and sort of build up a library of content and sort of cover the topics that I would like to cover. That's how I started. Off. I just wanted to make videos on stuff that I thought was interesting, how to use tools, how to perform, very basic stuff. And this would sort of, give me, this would sort of give the community a starting point, if you will. But of course, that changed over time. I realized that, that there was a lot that I could do with regards to video content and also written content. So I started taking that aspect of of our service delivery quite important, and I started the HackerSploit channel with that, as I said, as the objective, as the goal, as I pointed out in a different video. It was never about, I want to get YouTube famous, because again, at that time, it was really a very barren platform, and there weren't really any models to say, okay, I can become that, or at least on the side of technology. So it was more so, well, this is a great platform where I can share videos. The videos are easily indexed on Google, so users can essentially perform a search on Google, find the video, watch it, learn something. The video points them in the correct direction, etc., etc. So I think, at a high level overview, that's really how I got started in cybersecurity. As I said, at that time, the only way into it, because as I've pointed out many times, it's a very specialized industry and is sort of it's a synergy, or, it's where a lot of specializations or fields come together. I think I was very fortunate that I got into it through, system administration, and I had that previous experience of working in an enterprise environment and sort of managing infrastructure within an enterprise environment before I actually got to test it. Hopefully this sort of gives you an idea as to how I got started in it. And as I said, I've not covered a lot of other milestones. I've sort of gone over probably, I would say, 1 decade and a couple more years in a very short amount of time. But hopefully it gives you a context as to how I got started, where my strengths lie, and sort of why I got interested in cybersecurity. Because for me, it was really the first, when I was working as system administrator and I got introduced to cybersecurity, it was really, really fascinating, because I thought this is going to become very important. I didn't know that it would be, that the threat the threat surface would increase as it has, and there would be vulnerabilities in everything really, from mobile applications to websites and enterprise environments, and ransomware and malware and advanced persistent threats. That really wasn't in my mind, but I thought this is really, really cool, man. I mean, being able to legally, ethically test the security of an organization is I think, was what, really made sense to me. Plus, as I said, it was more so to begin with testing what I had put in place from a defensive side of things. So if I'd put in place a firewall or a security mechanism, whether it be a configuration or, all of that stuff, I really wanted to test and see whether I'd done a good job. So that's really, I think, what got me interested. And it actually showed me that, hey, just the blue team or defensive security side of things is not enough. You need to come together and verify that what you've done or what you've put in place is actually, has actually mitigated the vulnerability or will actually be able to withstand an attack. So yeah, didn't want to go over anything more. I would love to hear what you guys think. I'll probably be making a lot more videos like this, sort of, giving you guys advice and answering some of your more, deeper questions or more complex questions. And yeah, I'll also be getting a lot more guests on this show, just so that they can share their experience and they can also get a platform to discuss topics that are interesting or pertinent to them within cybersecurity. So that's going to conclude this episode. If you guys liked this episode, please leave a like down below. This podcast episode will also be available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. If you do like it, please leave a rating. Really appreciate it. If you find this helpful, then, please share it. I would love to hear your feedback. With that being said, I'll be seeing you in the next episode.